Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. Today we're taking a look at a figure who's known for being a logician, but really was a deep philosophical thinker, Alonzo Church.
Right. Yeah.
So when you think about Alonzo Church, you might not immediately think philosopher, but I think if you dig into his work a bit, you really start to see that he really did philosophy, but in a very specific way.
Definitely. He definitely had a particular way of going about it.
Yeah.
And I think that that's one of the reasons why he is sometimes not seen as a philosopher in the more traditional sense.
Right.
He wasn't writing treatises or big, tomes on, the nature of reality or whatever.
Right.
But he was really engaging with very deep philosophical questions, but using these very precise tools.
Yeah. And he saw, like you said, that these very precise tools were the best way to make actual progress in philosophy.
Yeah. He really felt like a lot of philosophical discussion lacked the rigor that he felt was necessary.
Yeah.
And so he really thought that formal logic was the way to go.
Yeah. I mean, imagine tackling these centuries-old questions about, the meaning of life, the nature of reality, all this stuff.
Right.
But doing it with the most precise tool imaginable, formal logic.
Yeah, yeah. He was all about clarity and rigor
Yeah.
and thought that those are just absolutely essential to move philosophy forward.
Yeah. I mean, it's really an interesting way to think about doing philosophy. So for our deep dive today, we're going to be looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Alonzo Church.
Great entry.
Really, really fantastic entry, incredibly comprehensive. It covers, not only his work, but also its philosophical implications.
Right. Yeah. Which is what's so key here.
Yeah, which is what we're interested in. We're not just interested in the technical details. We want to see how these technical details inform and relate to these philosophical questions.
Exactly. Exactly. We want to see Church in action as a philosopher.
Yeah, and that's kind of the mission for today's deep dive.
Right.
So we really want to understand how Alonzo Church, this guy who's known for his groundbreaking work in mathematical logic, how did he act as a philosopher? How did he take these logical insights and apply them to these really big questions in metaphysics, epistemology, the philosophy of language?
Yeah. And it's not just a historical exercise either.
You're
Right?
right.
I mean, this is a really relevant approach. There's a whole field now of, philosophical logic that really takes its inspiration from Church's work. So this is like a great shortcut for understanding this really important and influential approach to philosophical inquiry.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe we can start with, right away the entry mentions this idea of the logistic method.
Right.
What was Church's logistic method and why was it so central to his philosophical work?
Okay, so the logistic method is, at its heart, it's about applying formal logic to philosophical problems. So, formal logic is a system with, rigorously defined symbols and rules, kind of like a mathematical language. And Church felt that philosophical discussions that were more informal, while they can be useful, they often lack that real clarity and precision to really get at the core of some of these complex issues.
Okay.
And for him, the point of formalization wasn't just about, using fancy symbols.
Yeah.
It was really about making the underlying structure of arguments crystal clear so you can analyze them really rigorously.
So it's kind of like taking these fuzzy philosophical ideas that we have in our heads and translating them into a very precise logical language, right? So you can really see the connections and, if there are any inconsistencies or anything like that.
Yeah. And he was trying to achieve a couple things by doing this, right?
Right, yeah. What were some of his aims?
First, he wanted to make philosophical ideas and the arguments that support them much clearer and, less open to misinterpretation. Second, by putting them in this formal framework, he thought you could then use the tools of metalogic, which is the study of logic itself, to gain deeper insights.
Oh, okay.
And third, it's a much stronger way of actually checking if a philosophical argument holds up or not.
Right.
Can you prove it?
Yeah.
And he went so far as to say that, philosophers who didn't strive for this level of rigor in their work, they were just really missing something crucial.
Okay. So that's a pretty strong opinion. But, it's interesting because the entry does note that he wasn't a complete hardliner about this.
Right.
He didn't think that all branches of knowledge, like the natural sciences, for example, had to be formalized in this way.
Yeah. And he didn't always avoid informal discussion himself.
Right.
In the early stages of, hashing out an idea.
Right. Yeah.
He saw the value in that.
Yeah.
But he felt that for these fundamental philosophical questions, the real core issues that philosophers grapple with, the logistic method offered a really unique and powerful advantage.
Right.
It's like a high-precision tool for this delicate task.
Yeah.
And he really saw it as the best way to achieve genuine philosophical understanding.
Yeah. So the entry then moves on to his work on computability and something called Church's thesis.
Right.
This seems like a pretty mathematical concept. Like, how does this connect to him acting as a philosopher?
Yeah. I mean, this is a great example of where his work in logic, what seems very technical, really had these deep philosophical implications.
Okay.
So Church's work on something called the lambda calculus that provided a formal definition of what are called computable functions. So these are functions that can be calculated using a step-by-step process, like an algorithm.
Okay.
Then, with Church's thesis, what he proposed is that this formal definition that he gave actually captured perfectly our intuitive idea of what it means for a function to be calculable. What can actually be done, like by a mechanical procedure.
Right. Okay. So he's basically taking this sort of fuzzy idea, this intuitive idea that we have of what it means for something to be calculable, to be calculated by a machine, and he's giving it this really precise mathematical definition.
Exactly. He's like, let's make this really rigorous and precise. And it seems like a very technical move, but it really had some pretty big philosophical consequences.
Okay.
I mean, for one thing, it allowed him to show that there are some problems, even in basic number theory, that are unsolvable.
Wow.
And he was able to give a negative answer to something called the Entscheidungsproblem,
Okay.
which is a very famous problem in logic. It asks whether there is like a general algorithm you could use to decide if any statement in first-order logic is valid.
And the answer is no.
Right.
Okay.
So what he showed is that there are inherent boundaries to what algorithms can do,
Wow.
which is, that's a pretty deep philosophical statement about the limits of reason itself.
Yeah.
What can we know?
Yeah.
What can we compute?
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
so just by using his logical framework to define this idea of computability, he's then able to address these really big philosophical questions.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that even this very idea of Church's thesis itself generated some really fascinating philosophical debate.
Okay.
So, for example, Gödel, the famous logician Kurt Gödel,
Yeah.
he felt that Church's initial way of presenting the thesis didn't really give enough justification for equating our intuitive idea of what it means for something to be computable with this formal definition.
Okay.
He actually preferred Turing's analysis.
Okay.
Alan Turing, who's also very famous in computer science, he had this idea of a Turing machine.
Yeah.
And Gödel thought that that was actually a better way to approach this problem because it was rooted more in how a human computer would go about performing calculations.
Right.
So, even at this very technical level, you have these interesting philosophical disagreements about how to best understand and formalize these really basic concepts.
Right. Yeah. It's really fascinating to see how this all plays out. So the entry then moves on to his philosophy of logic. It mentions this idea that he had this belief in the generality of logic and this concern with avoiding paradoxes.
Right.
How did this shape his approach to acting as a philosopher?
So this belief in the generality of logic led him to accept not only the kind of basic version of formal logic, which is called first-order logic, but also these more powerful systems like second-order logic or even higher-order logics.
Okay.
And he argued that to really grasp the full scope of logic, you needed these richer and more expressive tools. And that itself was a kind of philosophical stance, right?
Yeah.
About, how broad and how capable is logical inquiry.
Right.
At the same time, he was really concerned with avoiding paradoxes. So paradoxes are these, self-contradictory results that pop up in logic.
Yeah.
And they're not just kind of, fun brain teasers.
Right.
They're actually really serious problems because they threaten to kind of undermine the whole system. They show that the system might be inconsistent. So this concern that he had really shaped the particular frameworks that he decided to work in, particularly something called type theory.
Okay. What's type theory?
So type theory, you can kind of think about it like a way of organizing things into categories or types to help avoid these kinds of errors.
Right.
So it's kind of like, making sure that you're not trying to add apples and oranges unless you have some really clear rule for how to do that.
Okay. Yeah.
So on the one hand, he saw these more complex systems like higher order logics as like necessary to really do good philosophical analysis.
Yes.
But he also saw them as a way to safeguard the system against inconsistencies.
Right. Okay. So it was like this balancing act between expressive power but also consistency.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay.
And for Church, the real goal of formal logic, the thing he really wanted to study, was the form of correct deductive reasoning.
Okay.
And he wanted to do this in a way that abstracted away from any specific subject matter.
Yep.
So, it didn't matter if you were talking about, the planets or about numbers,
Yes.
or about ethics.
Yeah.
It was about the structure of the argument itself.
Right.
And he thought that deductive reasoning was operating on propositions. So these are like the underlying meanings of statements.
Right.
And the study of logic was really the study of the logical form of these propositions.
Okay.
And this is where his logistic method really shines, because he really stressed the need for formalized languages rather than just, our everyday language.
Yeah.
So natural language is great for communication,
Right.
but it can be imprecise,
Yeah.
and it can kind of obscure the underlying logical structure.
Yeah. It's very ambiguous sometimes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So by creating these formal languages that had very clearly defined symbols,
Right.
rules for how to form statements,
Yeah.
axioms, these are like the basic truths that you start with,
Right.
and rules for how to draw conclusions from those axioms, which are called inference rules.
Yeah.
He could then analyze the logical form of arguments with a lot more precision.
Okay.
And this allowed him to define some really key concepts, like logical consequence.
Right.
What does it actually mean to say that, one statement logically follows from another?
Yeah. Yeah.
And this led to what we now consider like the standard way of understanding logical consequence,
Right.
which was pioneered by Tarski
Okay.
and then extended to these more powerful higher order logics by Church's student, Leon Henkin.
Yeah.
And all of this work is really reflected in Church's own work on logic.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So, his work in logic is very deeply tied to his views on what logic is.
Yeah.
It's not just some kind of technical exercise.
Right.
It's really about, what is logic?
Yeah.
What is the nature of logic?
So the entry talks about how he applied this logistic method to some like classic philosophical problems,
Right.
like his critique of logical empiricism, for example.
Yeah.
How did he actually use these tools to engage in these debates? Like, how was he acting as a philosopher in this case?
So this is a great example. The logical empiricists, they wanted to ground meaning in whether a statement could be verified through experience.
Okay.
And often they try to frame this, in terms of logical relationships.
Right.
And Church, he was like, okay, let's actually analyze this using formal logic.
Right. Yeah. Let's see if this actually makes sense.
Yeah. So he looked at their proposed criteria, particularly the criteria that A.J. Ayer had put forward in his famous book, Language, Truth, and Logic.
Okay.
And he showed very rigorously, through careful logical argumentation, that Ayer's criteria actually led to some really unacceptable consequences.
Okay.
Like, there were things that should clearly be meaningless,
Yeah.
according to the theory, but according to Ayer's rules, they would have to be considered meaningful.
Right. Yeah.
So he kind of showed that the theory was breaking down. This logical refutation, this very rigorous takedown, was one of the things that led to the decline of verificationism as like a serious philosophical contender.
Right. So it wasn't just that he was, coming in and saying, well, I think it's wrong because of this and this.
Right, yeah. He was just like, here's a better argument.
Yeah. He was saying, look, if we follow your rules, we get these absurdities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He was using logic as a tool to really dissect and take apart these existing philosophical theories.
Yeah. And this was really him acting as a philosopher in the best possible sense.
Right.
There's another example that the entry gives. This is his famous slingshot argument.
Oh, yeah.
So this argument was directed at the view that, sentences refer to propositions.
Right.
So this is like a classic philosophical view about meaning.
Right. Yeah.
But Church, he deploys this very concise logical argument that can be traced back to Frege
Yeah.
to basically show that if sentences actually refer to anything at all, they have to refer to truth values, not to propositions.
Right.
So whether they are true or false.
Yeah.
And this is a pretty radical claim.
It is. It is. It's saying that all these true sentences that we might think refer to all these different things,
Yeah.
they might all refer to the same thing,
Yeah.
because they share the same truth value,
Right.
which is a really weird and counterintuitive idea.
Yeah. And it really challenges a lot of our basic assumptions about language.
It does. It does.
So it's really interesting to see how, again, he's using this formal logical analysis to, uncover these unexpected connections and challenge our intuitions.
And showing that these tools can lead to really surprising results.
Yeah.
They can challenge our kind of common sense understanding of the world.
Yeah.
There's another argument that he made. This is his translation argument. This was aimed at people like Carnap and others who try to explain things like belief and assertion in terms of like the relationship that we have to certain sentence structures.
Okay.
As opposed to underlying propositions.
Okay.
So, they're saying, well, we believe a sentence because of, its structure or because of, how it's related to other sentences.
Right.
But Church pointed out that, look, if you translate these explanations into another language, the supposed equivalence breaks down.
Okay.
Because the sentences are only being mentioned in the analysis. They're not actually being used to, express the belief.
Right, right.
So he argued that a real explanation has to account for the underlying proposition, this abstract meaning, that stays the same even when you express it in different linguistic forms.
Right, okay.
So that really highlights this commitment he had to a realist view of propositions.
Okay.
The idea that propositions, these abstract meanings actually exist independently of language. And he uses logical argumentation to really defend that view against these alternative accounts.
So he's not just saying, I believe that propositions exist.
Well,
he's actually saying, I believe that propositions exist because if we look at the logic of these other views, they break down in this way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's like he's offering a logical defense of this philosophical view.
Right. Yeah. So, it really seems like across all these different areas of philosophy, whether it's, the foundations of mathematics or our understanding of language, he's constantly using his logistic method as his primary way of engaging philosophically.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it really does embody this idea of acting as a philosopher, but in a way that's very unique.
Yeah.
And he really saw this as the most dependable route to, philosophical clarity and truth.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just that, he was a logician who, dabbled in philosophy,
Right.
As a hobby. He was really a philosopher who thought that this rigorous analysis was like just part and parcel of doing serious philosophical work.
Right.
And you see this, in other places too, like the entry talks about his engagement with the paradox of analysis.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Which is this puzzle about how a definition can be both true and informative.
Right. Yeah. Like, how can you, define something without, already presupposing that you know what it is?
Right. Right. It seems like if you give a definition, it's either going to be circular or it's going to be uninformative.
Right.
But, we do give these definitions that seem to both be true and tell us something new.
Yeah. Like, the classic example is a bachelor is an unmarried man.
Exactly.
It's like, yeah, that's true. But, it also tells me something new, potentially.
Right. No, how does that work? And in Church, he drew on Frege's distinction between sense and denotation.
Okay.
So the sense of a term is like the way that the object is presented.
Okay.
And the denotation is the object itself.
Okay.
So he uses that distinction to explain how a statement like a brother is a male sibling can be both true and also tell us something new. So even though, we might already have the concept of brother, the definition kind of helps us to see it in a new light.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
And he actually went further than that. He developed a whole logical system, the logic of sense and denotation.
Okay.
It's often just referred to as LSD.
Okay.
And this was a direct attempt to build a formal system that could really capture these subtleties of meaning.
Okay.
Sense, reference, belief, all these things that philosophers care about.
Right.
And he believed that senses, these ways that objects are presented, they were objective.
Oh.
They existed independently of our minds and language.
Okay.
And that they're really necessary to explain, why an identity statement like, Hesperus is phosphorus can be informative.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
That's the classic example. It's like, well, they're both Venus.
Right.
But it's still informative to know that Hesperus is phosphorus.
Exactly.
Because they're different. They have different senses.
Right. Or how you can believe one but not the other, even though they both refer to the same thing.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So LSD, it faced its own challenges, like with paradoxes and things.
Yeah.
But it really represents a sustained effort to apply this logistic method to the very core of philosophical semantics.
Yeah. The entry also goes into his extensive work on paradoxes like Grelling's paradox, Russell's
Oh,
paradox,
yeah, he was very interested in paradoxes.
the Russell-Myhill paradox, and
Yeah.
even the knowability paradox. Um, how did his work on these paradoxes relate to his, bigger philosophical project?
So for Church, these paradoxes weren't just kind of, intellectual curiosities or puzzles.
Right.
He saw them as like serious threats to the consistency and coherence of our systems of logic and philosophy.
Yeah.
So his work on them, he analyzed Grelling's paradox in great detail.
Okay.
He compared Russell's and Tarski's approaches to resolving paradoxes, and this all shows this deep commitment he had to these foundational issues in logic, and this belief that a good philosophical system has to be able to confront these kinds of contradictions head on
Yeah.
and actually resolve them.
Yeah.
So he wasn't just going to kind of sweep them under the rug.
Right.
He was like, no, we need to figure out how to deal with these.
Yeah.
Um, and his exploration of something called ramified type theory, which is often shortened to RTT,
Okay.
as a potential solution, it shows just how far he was willing to go with these complex logical tools to try to achieve clarity and consistency.
Yeah. So it almost sounds like he viewed these paradoxes as kind of like, philosophical challenges that demanded these precise logical solutions.
Exactly.
And he wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty with these very, very technical tools.
No. And even when it wasn't his own work,
Yeah.
the entry mentions that he, like, even in referee report,
Yeah.
where he was reviewing someone else's work on the knowability paradox.
Yeah.
He just, it immediately was able to zero in on these potential flaws in the argument and really explore the logical consequences of the claims that were being made.
Right.
And he raised all these concerns about, how knowledge distributes over, combinations of statements and, whether there need to be restrictions on what kinds of things we can know.
Yeah.
And it just shows, his mind at work.
Right. Yeah.
This very sharp, very rigorous mind.
So we've talked about a lot of different areas, but the entry also mentions his views on the foundations of mathematics and his metaphysics.
Yeah.
How did this idea of acting as a philosopher manifest in those areas?
Okay, so in the foundations of math, Church was really concerned with two things.
Okay.
First, avoiding those paradoxes we were talking
Yeah.
about. And second, finding a logical system that was actually powerful enough to account for all of the math that we already know and love.
Right. Okay.
And he had this early attempt, this idea of a type-free foundation,
Okay.
which, it didn't quite work out the way he hoped it would,
Yeah.
but it actually led to the development of the lambda calculus,
Okay.
which, if you're a computer scientist, that's a really big deal.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's used all over the place in computer science and in formal semantics.
Okay.
So it's a great example of even these kind of failed logical endeavors can still have really important philosophical and practical consequences.
Right. Yeah.
And then later on, he became a big proponent of this idea of ramified type theory as a foundation that could actually satisfy these two key conditions.
Okay.
So, no paradoxes.
Yeah.
And it's strong enough to do all the math that we want to do.
Right.
And this is really interesting because it offers an alternative to set theory,
Right.
which is, traditionally seen as the foundation of math.
Yeah.
But Church is saying, no, maybe we can do it with types instead of sets.
Okay. So in metaphysics, how did he act as a philosopher in that area?
So in metaphysics, he was a big advocate for the idea that metaphysical theory should be reformulated and developed using this logistic method.
Yep.
And he famously argued that, this question of the existence of abstract entities, things like numbers or propositions,
Right.
do they really exist?
Yeah.
That's a big metaphysical question.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he argued that we should understand that in terms of what our best, most coherent theories actually commit us to.
Okay.
So he was like, look, if we develop our theories rigorously and they posit the existence of these things, then we have good reason to believe they exist.
Right.
But it's not just that he's saying that, we should just accept whatever our theories say.
Right.
He's saying our theories have to be developed within this rigorous framework of formal logic.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not just any theory goes.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. It has to be a well-formulated, logically sound theory.
So was he like a Platonist then? Did he think that abstract objects exist in this Platonic realm or something?
No. No. He actually rejected that. He called his view modest realism. And it wasn't about this mysterious, otherworldly realm of abstract objects,
Right.
like Plato's forms.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
was really about the idea that our best theories, you know, the ones that are most logically sound, they might require us to posit the existence of certain entities, whether they're abstract or concrete.
Okay.
And we should take that commitment seriously.
Right. So it's like, it's not that they exist independently of our theories.
Right.
It's that our theories, if they're good theories, they kind of force us to believe in these things.
Exactly. Exactly. It's kind of like if you have a good scientific theory, it's going to commit you to believing in certain entities.
Yeah.
Like electrons or quarks or whatever.
Right. Right.
Even though we can't see them directly.
Yeah.
Um, and he even argued that our way of knowing concepts and propositions, these abstract things,
Right.
it wasn't really fundamentally different from how we know physical objects.
That's okay.
He was like, both of them are mediated by our theoretical frameworks. It's our theories that tell us how to understand the world.
Right.
And he was a big defender of propositions.
Right.
He really felt that no adequate account of meaning could do without them.
Yeah.
He thought they were essential.
Okay. So it all comes back to this idea of using formal logic to address these really big philosophical questions.
Yeah.
And Alonzo Church really was, the epitome of acting as a philosopher in this very specific way.
Yeah, he was a real pioneer.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, he showed that logic isn't just this kind of abstract, theoretical thing.
Right.
It's actually a really powerful tool that you can use to address these real philosophical problems.
Yeah. Absolutely. So to recap a bit, Alonzo Church's philosophical approach was really rooted in what he called the logistic method,
Right.
which was the application of formal logic to philosophical problems with the goal of, achieving the maximum amount of clarity and rigor. And we saw this in action in so many different areas. His work on computability, his philosophy of logic itself, his critiques of logical empiricism, his arguments about propositions and truth values.
Yeah, even his engagement with all these paradoxes.
Yeah, the paradoxes and his views on the foundations of both mathematics and metaphysics.
Right.
He just brought these logical insights to bear on these big, really fundamental philosophical questions. And he really did act as a philosopher in this very distinctive and, I think, very influential way.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think, for the listener, one of the takeaways here is that, this stuff that might seem very abstract and technical, this work in mathematical logic, it actually has these deep implications for